this evening, we are looking at ancient Jewish astrology, fatalist or optimist. So I'm going to imagine that there are some people here logged on who absolutely love astrology, and they think it is an important part of their own spirituality or their own sense of self. And I'm going to assume there are other people who are just curious in some way about astrology and how it relates to Judaism. And there may be people here who don't think astrology should be trusted at all, or maybe it's not something that's Jewish whatsoever. And if in fact there is this mix of people that I really do expect here this evening, and that's actually a pretty good sample for how much of the Jewish tradition is around astrology. As you'll see, you'll get individuals in our history who are all about it. And then there are people who are, maybe somewhere in the middle. Then there are people who think it's totally forbidden and asur. And so we're going to take a journey through really the beginnings of our contact with astrology as Jews. And we're going to look at different expressions of Jewish astrology, how astrology in general was treated or understood by our ancestors. And as the title says, was it seen, if there were Jewish thinkers who believed in the power of astrology, was it this sense of we are predestined to live in a certain way because of the day we were born or the hour? Or are there ways that it can be more flexible? So this is a picture of yours truly. When I was a university student, I spent a lot of time playing music in parks. And I had a good amount of questions about life at this age. And indeed, I still do. But it was at this point in my own sort of journey that I gained an interest in astrology. Now, I hadn't formulated some of the questions, or I hadn't probed it as deeply, but I was interested. I had friends who knew a lot about it. And even if I wasn't sure, I actually kind of doubted if there could be planetary influence on our lives. There was this kind of curiosity in the different personality types of the different constellations, maybe the archetypes they represented. And it was just like, it was kind of something I had interest in. I remember having a particular conversation with a friend of mine who was Jewish, she was more traditional. And I just sort of mentioned something about this or talked about some fact or thing I had learned about astrology. And she quoted for me something that I had never heard before, but since then has been quoted to me several times. Ein mazal liYisrael. Again, that's pronounced, it looks like that. All right, transliterated. And it means something like, there is no constellation for Israel. And usually when this is said, it basically means Jews don't do astrology, or it's not okay for us, or we don't, we stay away from astrology. And in fact, this quote is from the Talmud. It is from a text that was, I guess, written over about 600 years. It was finally finished around 600 CE. And I heard this quote and I was sort of like, oh, I guess Jews don't do astrology. I sort of took it. I had never heard it before. I took it as maybe this is the way it is. And in fact, if you look in some of these older texts, some of these early rabbinic texts, you'll see there's a number of messages, something along the lines of Ein mazal liYisrael. There is no constellation for Israel, meaning there's nothing that's guiding us in the stars in the heavens. There's no either star or deity in the heavens, or what people used to believe back then in other cultures, that we don't rely on that. And of course, you'll notice that the word mazal here shows up, right? As in like mazel tov, right? This is a word we use today that means something along the lines of congratulations. It could probably be translated as good luck, but really, if you look at this, they mean there's a constellation, some kind of, so if you're wishing someone mazel tov, arguably in its original meaning, or at least as far back as we can go, this meant may the constellational influence be in your favor, be good. And so you even have this word, Ein mazal Israel. There's no constellation for Israel. But when did people start wishing each other mazel tov? right? Whereas maybe there was some kind of belief there. So this was a little bit perturbing to me. Again, I hadn't like bought into the entire astrological system, but there was something really. So a little while later, I came upon a book by an author, Rabbi Joel C. Dobin. And I don't even know that much about this rabbi, but he wrote a few books about astrology. And it started to open up, like, one, just a little bit more about astrology itself and what it was, because I was not so well educated in all these different parts of it. It's not, we all see these sort of horoscopes, right? We see them in the newspaper. That's how I first encountered it. And it was sort of very general, and it was more to do with what constellation you were born under, and that's all. But in fact, and I learned from this book, besides just Jewish astrology, the theory in general is there's actually, if you were to see a chart, this is sort of a random date I chose. You can get this, you can enter your birth date online, and there's many, many factors, right? There's not just where the Earth was in the cosmos. It's also where the sun was, where the moon was, where all of the planets were. And an individual can have an extremely robust and complex chart. And not just individuals, but in fact, astrology for a long time was used for the kind of the state of the world, like to predict events, catastrophes and blessings and all of these things. And so this book started presenting some counter narratives besides Ein Mazal Israel, right? There's something else going on. So I want to show you a couple pictures. And these I find very striking. So this is Beit Alpha. This is a 6th century synagogue, right, in modern day Eretz Yisrael. And this is the central mosaic in the synagogue, right? I mean, meaning there were other mosaics there, but when they discovered this, actually relatively recently in the past 100 years, this was the most prominent mosaic in the synagogue. And if you'll see here, this is an image of the sun god. I believe the Roman sun god, Greek sun god Helios. Okay, and around here you'll see these are the zodiac signs. They're not the flags of the tribes of Israel, though there is some correlation there at other points. But if you look here, for example, you have Gemini, right? That says Teomim in Hebrew. That literally these are just direct translations from the Greek into the Hebrew. Okay, and you have here's Leo, the lion. It says Aryeh. It's hard to see, but essentially this was a 6th century synagogue that had at its center, as its centerpiece, the zodiac. So that's interesting and strange, perhaps. Could this be a one-off, a coincidence, maybe a fringe group? I mean, look, whether you're looking at small examples, anytime you're having a Greek sun god in your synagogue, it could have been a forgotten era, whatever it was. This is not so common from what we see, but it's around. And you see this here as well. This is another synagogue. This is Hamat from the 4th century. Just so you're aware, both of the synagogues, when they were uncovered, like the era that they're from, this would have been when the rabbis in the Talmud were writing and discussing and composing this. I mean, really, it was started out as discussions. It became this written document. But astrology, in some way, from this archaeological record, was alive. And again, here you see the sun god, and you see, I think that says Dagim. It's upside down, but that's Pisces. Okay, just fish. Okay, Gedi is another one. Which one would Capricorn? Here we go. That's Gedi. That's a literal Hebrew translation. I guess it's a goat. So there's other things to be said here besides Ein Mazal Yisrael. And so at this, essentially this juncture in time, you have a lot of, among other things, Babylonian influence. So the Babylon, right? So there's the Babylonian Talmud, of course. And before that, there was a Babylonian civilization known as Chaldea, Chaldea. And in Chaldea, from what we can tell, and we being the historians, I have read their works, that Chaldea was where astrology came from. There's some thoughts it maybe came a little bit earlier, but it's most easy to say that we can know with most certainty that it came from Chaldea in Babylon. And it through the Greek and Roman society, it made its way into Jewish civilization. And in fact, you'll see there's all sorts of influences that it had. So this is 360 degrees. All right. So why is it 360 degrees? If you'll notice, we have a lot of things in our culture right now that have to do with the number 60. There's 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. All right. Again, there's 360 degrees. That's Babylonian civilization at this time had a base 60 numerical system. Okay. That means that they didn't have 10 digits. They had 60 digits. So you actually see in the Talmud, through this influence, you hear about, oh, well, if you have, let's say, a pot of kosher food and you accidentally, some kind of pork or pork soup or something spilled into it, as long as it's no more than 1/60th, it's kosher, right? Why not 1/10 or 1/100th? The 60 is all over the place in these measurements, okay? They say that dreams are a 60th of prophecy. You can see these kinds of teachings. And essentially, it came from this numerical system. And what you have also, if you've heard, maybe you have heard of the 36 hidden tzaddikim, that this belief that also is first mentioned in the Talmud, essentially that there are 36 hidden righteous people doing good at all times. And through their merits, the world is sustained. So why 36? Okay, so actually, in the this is theorized. We don't know for sure, but in the Babylonian system, the astrological system, there were 36 specific deities that took up in the cosmos, in the sort of the sphere of the universe. They each took up 10 degrees. So there were 36 Babylonian gods, and some people say, major figures including Gershom Scholem, a major historian of Jewish mysticism, they say that that is where this 36 number came from as a significant number for the hidden tzaddikim. That, as we'll see later on, I mean, first of all, this is in every area, essentially, where we're influenced by other cultures. Judaism needs to digest or take in this other philosophy in a way that is going to be coherent and agreeable with the average Jew, or at least with the intellectuals. And so it's in some way adopted, right? And the interesting thing, just for today, and we're so close to Hanukkah, these 36 hidden tzaddikim are correlated in later thought with the 36 Hanukkah candles. So if you were to take every single Hanukkah candle minus the shamash, which is the helper candle, it's not really a Hanukkah candle, and you go 1 + 2 + 3 all the way up to 8, you get 36. So they say that these 36 Hanukkah candles, it's like this hidden light. These like just like these hidden tzaddikim, the Hanukkah allows us to tune into the hidden light that might not be visible, but is there at all times. So there's a huge influence that Babylonian society has on us through many means. And one of the largest ways is through the Talmud. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Talmud or studied the Talmud. I want to just give a little bit of a framing of, to some degree, why I'm going to be focusing on Talmudic stories. So why not elsewhere, before, after? So this book, as I said, was completed in 600 CE. And though I would say most Jewish practitioners in the world are influenced by the Talmud in major ways, but most of us don't realize it. That many of us go to synagogue and we think, oh, it's about the Torah, right? Or maybe about the rest of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. But in fact, it is impossible today for anyone who's a Jewish practitioner to really be able to view the Torah without the lens of the Talmud in some way, big or small. There are vast amounts of rituals that occur for the first time in the Talmud that are not in the Torah. To use a very common ritual, the lighting of Shabbat candles does not appear in the Torah. It appears first in the Mishnah, and it's spelled out more in the Talmud. And there's many, many things like this, that if we think we are people of the book, right? We're actually people of books, many, many books, right? The Talmud is 37 tractates. And things like, first of all, the holiday of Hanukkah doesn't appear in the Bible, okay? Tu B'Shvat doesn't appear in the Bible. Tisha B'Av, Rosh Hashanah, okay, itself is like a very small mention as the day of calling out in the Torah, but it's not called Rosh Hashanah. right? It's called Rosh Hashanah in the Talmud. Basically, there's a tremendous influence that this text has on all of us. And it started as these discussions and later was written down. So to some degree, I'm exploring these stories and these teachings, and there's a few purposes, and I'll just sort of, to be honest, some of these teachings are, I think, very thought-provoking and very like legitimate for our own ethical inquiries. All right, this is just, sorry, this popped up a little early. This is a quote from Leviticus, from the Torah. And often the Talmud, even though it might be creating or generating new ideas, new practices, it really ties it back into the Torah, and it reads itself into the So as I was saying, this is a quote from the book of Leviticus, and it is interpreted by the Talmud in a few different ways. So it's basically a prohibition against divination and soothsaying, soothsayers. What's a soothsayer? So I was about to say, before I was so rudely interrupted, that the Talmud, among its wisdom and its philosophy and its practices and everything, there's also some things that, to my ear and eye at least, sound a little bit funny. And I don't think they meant it to be, but I had to just show you one of the ways that they interpret what is a soothsayer. And there's maybe a little bit even of a trigger warning here. Hey, one opinion in the Talmud. This is one who applies 7 types of semen to one's eye in order to perform sorcery. Rashi comments, medieval commentator Rashi says, there was sorcery in which someone took 7 different animals and their semen and put them in their own eye and used them to curse people or do sorcery. Okay, so this is not astrology. In this case, soothsaying, and this is divination, is not astrology. It's something else, okay? Someone else says, this is one who deceives the eyes as though he is performing sorcery. So some kind of faker, right? Someone who's going and essentially tricking people into believing that he is a powerful sorcerer in order to influence them. All right, I'm trying to show, at least in parts, these multiple views in the Talmud. And then the third, this is maybe more about astrology. Like, so what is this prohibition they're reading into this line in Leviticus? Though the Torah never mentions astrology, which is important. It never mentions astrology, and it's only mentioned briefly in other parts of the Bible. It comes in the Talmud, all right? So this is one who calculates the fortune of times and hours and says, for example, today is a favorable day for going away on a journey. Tomorrow is favorable for purchasing property successfully. So essentially, you have this multiple ways of interpreting what's going on in this verse. And as we'll see, these voices kind of continue throughout. Like, as if there's no prohibition literally in the Torah anywhere against astrology, it's not even mentioned, then, well, where do people come to prohibit? Some people prohibit astrology, and this could be like something like this: divination, soothsaying, perhaps. All right, but if we look, I want to come back to a particular passage that I mentioned right at the beginning. And that was eons ago, in last meeting, really. And it was this idea that Ein Mazal Israel, there's no constellation for Israel, okay? And when, in my own personal journey of looking through these sources over the years, after hearing that, and it affected me, I was like, oh, I guess we don't do astrology. I found the original place where it occurs. It's in the tractate that talks about Shabbat. There's a whole section that just goes on a long discourse about astrology. And it says, in fact, before it says Ein Mazal Yisrael, it says Rabbi Chanina, okay, a constellation makes one wise and a constellation makes one wealthy, meaning there's the mazal of wisdom, the mazal of wealth, and there is a constellation for the Jewish people. Literally in Hebrew, yesh mazal leYisrael, which is the opposite of ein mazal. Yesh means there is, ein means there isn't. So before it even says ein mazal leYisrael, it says yesh mazal Israel. And Rabbi Chanina, this is a major figure. This is not some, like, it's part of the debate. This is a voice that's articulated in this era. And only after that, in response, Rabbi Yochanan says, another major figure, there is no constellation for the Jewish people. right? No, Ein Mazal Yisrael. This is the argument back and forth. So essentially, the kind of the plot thickens, right? We get to a place where it's actually not so clear. What is the Talmudic belief? First of all, maybe I haven't said this clearly enough. And if you've ever taken a class with me, hopefully I've spelled it out there. There is no the Talmudic view on almost anything. It is in so many ways in tune with this Jewish culture we have into this day of discussing. And it's okay to disagree. In fact, it's required. And there are certain things that most people are going to agree on, right? Like basic ethical elements of life, but there's so many opinions on theology, on astrology, on ritual, on everything. So right here, these are the two major positions. Of course, there's a star influencing us. Of course there isn't. So before we go any farther, I want to just ask if there's any questions, any comments. We can take a couple minutes, and of course, if you don't want to say anything, I can continue, but I think this is a good stopping place before we go any farther. And you can unmute yourselves and ask. All right, well, I'll keep going. So essentially, if there is an astrological tradition, a tradition of astrology in Judaism, as I was saying at the beginning, it must be filtered through the culture. That happens. I don't know if it's possible for a culture to understand or to relate with something unless they're relating it to something they already know or experience. So I wanted to present to you a Talmudic form of astrology that is not, it's not what you would normally see anywhere. I have not seen this anywhere else. So what it basically does, this is sort of a children's version of the first chapter in Genesis, right? You have a creation, okay, the different days and what happens on each day. So there is a kind of halfway point between astrology as this sort of fatalistic kind of something that could change or determine who you were going to be based on when you were born, right? But it isn't about these stars or the heavens or really the cultures that were existing at these times, the gods up there. It's actually about the 7 days of creation. So I've created a chart. We don't need to go through every single one, but essentially on Sunday, day one, Yom Rishon, okay, what was the big part was darkness and light. So they say if you're born on a Sunday, you're going to be either totally good or totally bad, right? This is one of the systems that is spelled out in the Talmud. So on Monday, on the other hand, it's all about the separation of the upper waters and the lower waters. So it says, if you're born on that day, you're going to be short-tempered because it's all about conflict and difference and separation, right? So it doesn't, truth be told, all have to do exactly with the creation narrative, because Friday is not seen as the day of the animals and humans being created. It's seen as the day before Shabbat. And if you're born on a Friday, you're going to be eager for mitzvot because you're preparing for Shabbat, right? Someone who's just like very zealous about their practice, or a seeker perhaps. And someone who's born on Shabbat, on Saturday, they say two things. One, that they're a holy person because they're born on the sacred day. And secondly, it says they're going to die on Shabbat. If you're born on Shabbat, you're going to die on Shabbat. Why? Because you've caused someone to violate Shabbat by being born on Shabbat. So it's sort of like a karmic retribution that you're also going to die on Shabbat. It's predetermined. And this is one way that they understand this kind of confluence of ideas and cultures, right? And it, to some degree, it is quite, looking at this, if I could show you the, if you're curious, I'm actually going to be sending a link for a source sheet with all of these, you can see the actual Talmudic discussions. And it is pretty predetermined. There's, in that section, there's no conversation about, well, maybe they'll be like this. No, this is how they're going to be. But on the other hand, it doesn't involve stars or the heavenly bodies. It involves the Torah, right? And the story of creation. Similarly, there's another, really, if we want to talk about some kind of, it's kind of an in-between, and it's with a particular character. And this character is named Shmuel. Shmuel is, again, a very significant Talmudic rabbi. And there's a midrash where he's interpreting what it means in the Torah when it says that the Torah is not in heaven. And he says, oh, the Torah was not commanded in astrological signs, since belief in them is in the heavens, right? He's kind of comparing the Torah, which is here, to the astrological signs, which are in the heavens. And they said to Shmuel, but hey, aren't you an astrologer? Like, they're saying, they identify this great Talmudic sage as an astrologer. And he doesn't say, I'm not. He says, I only look at the astrological signs when I am free from the Torah. And like, what does that mean when there's no Torah around, when you're free from the Torah? And he says, it's when I enter the bathhouse. Literally, when he's in the bathhouse, think about like a communal bathhouse. There were prohibitions around engaging with Torah, essentially, in there. And he's saying, that's when I'm an astrologer. And so there's actually similar questions that are brought up about idols, Roman gods that are in the bathhouse. And they're saying, wait, isn't that prohibited? Well, they're not prohibited in the bathhouse. You know, they are prohibited to be worshipped, but no one worships in the bathhouse, right? It's this kind of in-between world to some degree. So again, it's there, it's around, but it's kind of, there's limitations. And as I said, there are straight up prohibitions that exist. And there's also these, I think, strange and amazing midrashim in which they are praising certain biblical characters as being astrologers, essentially. So there's a line in the book of Genesis, Bereshit, it says, V'Adonai berach et Avraham bakol. So God blessed Avraham bakol. What does bakol mean? It means with everything, like with all of it. God blessed Avraham with everything. And so this is interpreted. What does it mean with everything? And there's a variety of answers given. One of them, by Rabbi Elazar HaModai, he says, Avraham Avinu, Abraham our father, was so knowledgeable in astrology that all the kings of the east and the west would come early to his door due to his wisdom. This is the blessing of bakol, of with everything, that he possessed knowledge that everybody needed. So they're identifying, right? Or one voice is identifying Avraham Avinu as a great astrologer, right? They're looking back. This, say what you want, this does not feel to me like a prohibitive voice. In fact, they're ascribing one of the greatest characters in the whole Bible as, they're ascribing him with the gifts of astrology. And that meant he had everything. He had every single thing you could want. And it, of course, included the wisdom of astrology. Later on, they also talk about how he had a healing stone as a necklace, and everyone who gazed upon the stone would be healed. Like, there was a lot of content in the Talmud that kind of doesn't often get presented to most of us in our general upbringing or raising in the tradition. But I mean, to some degree, some of the Talmudic sages are pretty New Age. And I mean, obviously that's tongue in cheek, but there's also into crystal healing, right? We have examples of that. We have examples of astrology. And now, essentially, we're getting into the tastiest part of our presentation. This is a date palm. And there are, I'm showing this image because there are very significant, there's stories that are told about astrologers. One of them includes a date palm that, for me, really start to get into the essence of really sort of why I'm presenting this in the first place. Because this particular way that they digest astrology, it just sort of, for lack of a better term, it resonates with my Jewish neshama. Like I find it a lovely interpretation and understanding. So there's 3 stories that I'm gonna show you. And again, there's a source sheet I have with all of them written on it. I'm gonna send out in the chat. But essentially, the first one goes like this: that Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, okay, was a Talmudic sage and a Chaldean, meaning a Babylonian astrologer, told his mother, your son will be a thief. So this Talmudic sage it was predicted when he was a child that he was going to be a thief by an astrologer. And they bring this story as proof, as you'll see, that there is no Mazal Israel. In Mazal Israel, this is proof that there's no constellation of Israel. Okay, but let's hear the story. So your son will be a thief. So she did not allow him to uncover his head, meaning she always had a head covering on him. She said to her son, cover your head so that the fear of heaven will be upon you, and pray for divine mercy. Now, the fear of heaven in this context has a pretty specific meaning. It means like the love of heaven or the love of God has in this world has more to do often with doing positive mitzvot, like things that we're supposed to be doing. I'm supposed to pray in this way, or I'm supposed to rise at this time. I'm supposed to celebrate this holiday. And fear in this sense is staying away from the prohibitions, right? Love is more, has this positive commandment sense, and fear has this negative commandment sense. Often, it's not exclusively, but that's a common meaning. So she gave him a head covering to remind him of the fear of heaven. So, and to pray essentially so that he wouldn't be a thief. Okay. So he did not know why she said this to him. One day he was sitting and studying beneath a palm tree that did not belong to him, right? Under this date palm. It wasn't his. And he was studying. And the cloak, meaning he probably had a hood or something. I don't believe they had kippot like we would have today back then, but he had some kind of head covering, but the cloak fell off of his head. He lifted his eyes right away and he saw the palm tree. Suddenly, it's like his eyes were opened, right? He was studying, it falls off his head, and whoa, where did that palm tree come from? He was overcome by impulse and he climbed up and detached a bunch of dates with his teeth, meaning he stole them. It was that moment when his head covering came off. He was no longer under the fear of heaven or praying, right? And that was the moment where he finally became a thief. Apparently, he had an inborn inclination to steal, it says, but was able to overcome that inclination with proper education and prayer. So that's the story, right? It's sort of in this section. This is their proof that Ein Mazal Yisrael, that there's no constellation, there's no governing force of astrology for Israel. And the proof, it's an interesting proof, isn't it? That the astrologer predicted he was going to be a thief. His mother gave him a barrier around it, right? Some kind of protection, right? Through a mitzvah, or through thinking of God. It came off and he did it. So he had that inborn inclination. This is, and oh, here's my boy, just 1 second. This is a second intermission. All right. Mercury, I don't know. I'm not a good enough astrologer to know if Mercury is in retrograde, but that's what might be happening here. All right. So, but basically, it's an interesting proof. It's like the astrologer was kind of right, but Ein Mazal Yisrael. So it doesn't, we're not governed by that stuff. Okay. The next story is from Rabbi Akiva and his daughter. It says Rabbi Akiva was told, again, this is to disprove this axiom. Rabbi Akiva was told, before his daughter was getting, well before it seems like, that his daughter was going to be bitten by a snake and die on her wedding day. Okay, an astrologer, a Chaldean, told him this, and I guess he told her, and she was very worried about it. And the story goes, finally on her wedding day, she took the ornamental pin from her hair and stuck it into a hole in the wall for safekeeping. And it happened that it entered directly into the eye of the snake. In the morning, when she took the pin, the snake was pulled and came out with it. So she didn't die. She didn't get bitten. In fact, the snake died on her wedding day. And her father, Rabbi Akiva, said to her, what did you do to merit being saved from the snake? What could you have possibly done to have earned this great boon? And she told him, in the evening, a poor person came and knocked on the door. And everyone was preoccupied with the feast, and nobody heard him. I stood and took the portion that you had given me and gave it to him. Rabbi Akiva said to her, you performed a mitzvah and you were saved in its merit. So she gave him, assumably, food. Right? It could have been something else. Could have been a portion of inheritance, even, that she did this great mitzvah. And this, again, I don't want to sort of repeat it too much, but just, it's a very important point. This is their proof Ein Mazali Israel, that we're not governed by the stars. And I don't think it's a proof at all. Like, or certainly it's not a proof for what we usually think of, or what we might think, that we're not governed by astrological signs. What this seems to be saying, and you'll see in the next story as well, which is actually quite similar, that the astrologers have something going on. Like they're kind of right, that they have this ability to predict things with a fair amount of accuracy, right? The thievery, and in this case, the snake, I mean, that's very specific. But what Ein Mazali Israel seems to mean is that Jews, or look, today I could universalize it, okay? But in that time, they meant that a Jewish person has the capacity to override this fatalistic prediction, even though there's something to there, right? They can override it through being a good person, right? Or through like having a special relationship with God, or either one. But the next one you'll see is similar to the first, or similar to the second, and it has the same notion. Okay, we have essentially, another story that comes, and it says, the Gemara relates to Shmuel again. Shmuel being this astrologer we know, we talked about him earlier, that him and the Gentile sage Ablet were sitting, and they saw these people were going to the lake. There's some people who are going to a lake, and Ablet said to Shmuel, right? Ablet's obviously, we'll see, a kind of astrologer. This person will go. He's pointing to one of them. He's going to go, and he will not return, because a snake will bite him and he will die. Shmuel said to him, if he is a Jew, he will go and come back. So again, this is a pretty interesting moment, because it says here, if he's a Jew, he'll go and come back. But Shmuel doesn't say if he's a righteous Jew. It just says if he's a Jew. As they were sitting for a while, the person they discussed went away and returned. Oh, sounds like Shmuel's right. Ablet stood up, threw down the person's burden, meaning like he had like a bag with him. He threw it on the ground, and inside he found a snake cut into 2 pieces. Shmuel said to him, what did you do to merit being saved from death? So again, somehow this snake got cut up. It actually doesn't specify how it happened, but this guy had a snake in his bag. And Shmuel's like, wow, that was pretty close. What did you do? And the person said to him, every day we all take bread together and eat from the bread. Today, there was one of us who did not have bread. And when it came time to gather the bread, he was embarrassed because he did not have any to give. I said to the others, I will go and take the bread. When I came to the person who did not have bread, I rendered myself as one who is taking from him so that he would not be embarrassed. Meaning, this individual that had been predicted to die by snake bite, not only did he share bread with someone who didn't have it, who was in their party, he made it look like he was the one who was borrowing and that the other person had it. Like he was really going out of his way not to embarrass him. And just sort of by the by, as a way of lending and borrowing and having that relationship, I'm really taken by stories I hear from our world of people who notice that neighbors are borrowing things from them because they're in need. And so they, even though they aren't in need, they go and they borrow salt or something simple because it actually kind of allows that relationship to flow more easily. So I think it's a really big mitzvah to do what he did. And Shmuel said to him, in fact, you performed a mitzvah. You went out and taught based on this incident. And he goes and teaches this line from Proverbs, it appears, and charity will save from death. So it does not only mean it will save a person from an unusual death, but even from death itself. So essentially, this story, like the one before it and like the one before it, but in a different way, talks about and shows that really the proof is that Jews, at least in this case, are able to override the predictions of the astrologers and the signs in heaven because of good deeds. And I just wanted to go back and point out again for a second that Shmuel says if he's a Jew, he'll survive. But it really ultimately doesn't have to do if he's a Jew or not. It has to do with if he's a good person. And it's just a curious juxtaposition. It's almost, maybe this slogan, Ein Mazali Israel, came beforehand and they're interpreting in a later way, but it doesn't quite line up one to one. But I just want to say the reason these stories speak, as I said, to my Jewish neshama, I think it's about astrology, but it's also just about sort of our life circumstance. I feel like we have a capacity to override negative things, negative character traits we might have inherited. Maybe it was a a birth thing, an upbringing thing. Maybe we're just in a bad string of luck. But I truly believe that acts of kindness, taking care of ourselves, being good people, having a relationship with spirit, have a capacity to change things for the better, whether or not whether or not we may believe that, or whether or not that might seem obvious. So this essentially has been the overview of the Talmudic astrology in particular, and looking at how our ancestors expressed their own astrologies and how they measured and weighed this potentially enticing, potentially dangerous or foreign energy in their midst, and how I really think that they drashed it and interpreted in a way that rings true to a lot of Jewish teachings.